Hey, we are kicking off a brand new teaching series this morning called Jesus is Better. I am so excited because I've known for several months that this was going to be the summer focus here at New Point. And what we're going to be doing through this summer is looking and studying through the book of Hebrews. One of my all-time favorite books, especially in the New Testament. It is so rich. It is so good. It tells us how we ought to live our life. It tells us that Jesus is better. It's going to be just an incredible time of learning and studying and growing together. Here's my thought, my challenge to all of us is that all of us would take some time here in the near future to just read through the book of Hebrews. It gets you up to speed on some of the things we're going to be studying. It will take you probably a half hour to read through it, unless you struggle with reading. It might take you longer than that. But there's audio Bibles, right? You can do that. So, but what I would recommend is that you would actually read through it in one sitting. Hebrews is a letter, classified as a letter. It actually starts as a sermon. It ends as a letter. And when you read a letter, you understand that letters are intended to be read all at once in one time. And so I just encourage you to sit down with the book of Hebrews sometime here in the near future, get caught up to speed on all the things God wants us to learn this summer, and we're going to unpack it in the Sundays to come. Hey, as we get started this morning, I want to kind of throw a question your way, and that question is, how do we determine whether or not something is better? How do we determine whether or not something is better? Think about that in your life. I want you to maybe think about some of the biggest purchases of your life. Think about, for most of us, it'd be like houses that we've bought or vehicles that we've bought, things that cost, a lot of money. And, rarely do you ever find someone who buys a house or buys a car without looking at all sorts of different options, looking at all sorts of different choices. Because if you're going to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on a house, you're going to want to make sure that that's a wise investment, right? You're going to want to make sure that you don't just buy something that is a foolish purchase. And so what people typically do is they go and they find a realtor. That realtor, shows them all sorts of different houses, right? And through a process, they begin to sort of whittle down to just like a select few that they decide, or they have to decide between. It seems true like if you go buy a car, you're going to spend tens of thousands of dollars on a vehicle, you want to kind of make sure that this is a wise investment. And so people typically go and they maybe visit a couple different dealerships. They do some research online. Maybe even test drive some vehicles, right? And so how we determine whether or not something is better is kind of through this process of comparison, right? We compare, we look at all the differences between things. If I was going to buy a house, which a year and a half ago we purchased a house, and I was going to, start out with a lot of homes and kind of whittle it down to maybe two. And I'm trying to decide between two houses. I'm going to go through this process of comparison where, I'm going to, look at these two homes. Maybe I like them both the same or similar. I can afford them both. I think they're both good houses. But as I go through this process of comparison and looking at the differences, and I decide or I realize that one house is clearly better than the other, then I'm going to just go with the better house, right? That's just kind of what it is. And so ultimately how we determine whether or not something is better is by what we choose. That's really how we determine through our choices, what we choose in life. And typically, in most cases, what we choose is what we have become convinced is better. And what's unique about that is that it doesn't even really have to be a better choice. We just have to be convinced that it's a better choice. In fact, we know that all the time people make choices that are actually harmful to their life. They make choices that are not good for them. Some of us, are like living proof of making bad choices in our life, and yet what typically happens at the onset, at the on-ramp of these choices is that most people are convinced in that moment that it's the better road, that it's a better path, that it's the better choice. About 15 years ago, there was a survey that was conducted of people who attend church in the United States. And what the survey discovered, what it found out, was that of people who attend church regularly, so these are like your people these are you guys, people who are here at church often, not just your, a couple times a year or every so often, but people who attend church regularly, what the survey discovered was that of those people, only 55% said that their faith affected the way that they live. It's an astonishing number, isn't it? Because it gives us a lot of data. It gives us like the other side of that reality, that there was 45% of people who attend church regularly who would say that their faith doesn't affect the way that they live. I saw that data this week, and as a pastor, obviously these are things that I look at and I'm grieved over and I wonder about. And I said, man, how could that be? How could it be that sort of your top tier people, these are the people who are in church, they're coming most weeks, they beat the national average. The national average, by the way, of church attendance is 1.7 times a month. That's awful, by the way. But if you didn't know, that's awful. But how do you, so I'm like, how is it possible that nearly half the people who attend church on a regular basis would say that their faith doesn't affect the way that they live their life? Do you want to know how? You want to know why that's possible? You want to know why that's possible for two people to come to church week in and week out, one person to have their faith affect their life and the other person to have their faith not affect how they live their life? The reason why that happens is because for that 45%, they've yet to become convinced that Jesus is really the most important thing in their life. They've yet to become convinced by it. They like Jesus. They don't want to like completely get him out of their life, but they've yet to become completely convinced that he really is the most important thing in their life. I love what A.W. Tozer says. He says this, he says, what comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. What comes into our mind when we think about God? The thoughts that we have, the views that we hold, the images that we see, the love that we have, the thoughts that come into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us, most important thing about you, and it's the most important thing about me. If we really don't believe that Jesus is better than anything else, we will find ourselves always looking for something out there that is better than Jesus. There's probably living proof in here this morning, right, of stories of us looking for things in life that are better than Jesus. And the classics are, we try to look for it in money. We try to look for it in things like power and promotions. We try to look for it in, things like love and sex. And we try to look for it in things like, just accumulating possessions. If I can just get that next vacation, if I can just buy that next whatever. And we kind of start living for this desire to just live this comfortable life and to just acquire more and have more. And it's more just focused on ourselves. And if we don't really believe that Jesus is better, then that's the path that we go on. And maybe you're here and you could identify with the 45% who say, my faith doesn't really affect the way that I live. Maybe just a little, but not really affecting the way I live my life. People like that, what I would say is that there will always be something else that will edge out Jesus. There will always be something in your life that will edge out Jesus. It will become a higher priority. It'll become more important. Man, I'm like, living proof of how that can happen. It's so easy to allow other things to just sort of edge out Jesus. But for you and I, we have to be so sure and so convinced that Jesus is the most important thing in our life. I could probably drop the mic here already, and I might here in a second, but let me just give you something this morning, all right? I want to just give you a thought here today. Jesus isn't just good for you, Jesus is better for you. Man, we live in a world where there are all kinds of people who would come up to you or come up to me and they'd kind of give us those cliche comments, like Christianity is good for you, it's just not good for me, right? That's like your thing, that's just not my thing. Or like, man, Jesus seems to be good for you. He seems to be doing good things for you. That's just not for me. Be so clear this morning that Jesus is not just good for you, Jesus is better for you. Come on, that's good stuff right there. I want to get us, unpacking the book of Hebrews together, and we're going to look at this brand new series. And there is just this theme, there is just this focus, this like passionate goal that I have for all summer long for those of us here together, learning together on Sundays. And it's It's the goal of this series. The goal of this series is to know Jesus so well that our lives would rightly reflect who he is. That is the 100% goal of this entire series all summer long. It's going to be woven throughout all the teaching, throughout Hebrews, and throughout all the teaching here on Sunday mornings, is that we would know Jesus so well that our lives would rightly reflect who he is. Because here's the problem, and I'm not trying to bash on people. You know I'm not that kind of guy, but there are a lot of Christians out there whose lives wrongly reflect who Jesus is. I mean, there are a lot of Christians even here, right? Come on, let's be honest. Whose lives wrongly reflect who Jesus is. I mean, there are moments and seasons and times in my life where my life wrongly reflects who Jesus is. And everywhere you go, man, people seem to have this idea of who Jesus is. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's the right idea. They just have an idea. People who don't go to church, they would have an idea as well of who Jesus is. And so I just want our lives to rightly reflect who Jesus is, that the image that we cast out there to people about Jesus, the thoughts that our lives kind of create for people about Jesus would rightly reflect who he is. And for some people, maybe the encounters that they would have with people in this room would start to sort of reframe for them the image of who Jesus is. Maybe they would learn that they had a wrong image of Jesus all these years. And because they come into a relationship or encounter with people who know who Jesus really is, it starts to reframe for them or redefine for them who the God of the universe really is. And that's the goal of this summer, is that we would learn to know Jesus so well that our lives would rightly reflect who he is. And so I'm going to get into Hebrews this morning, and let me just give you some peace. I'm only going to get into like the first 4 verses of Hebrews, and I'm also going to jump a ways down and give you maybe the theme verse of Hebrews. So we're not going to do a ton of expository teaching today. I'm just going to kind of try to just preach. If you let me, come on. All right, so we're gonna do this, but what I got to do is give you some background to this powerful book in the New Testament. I got to give you just a lot of understanding of what it is and why it is, right? And so one of the most fascinating details to the book of Hebrews is that we do not know who wrote it. It's really interesting, It's rare to have this happen where we don't know who it is. Now, we know who divinely authored the book of Hebrews. We know that all Scripture is inspired and breathed by God, right? We know that to be clear, but we don't know who actually penned the book of Hebrews, pen to paper. There's a lot of fascinating theories out there. A lot of people think that maybe it was the Apostle Paul because there are some similarities, but there's also just enough differences because we clearly have other letters that he wrote, other books that he wrote, where there's just differences in the writing styles. And so I think it's actually probably a weak argument to say that it was the Apostle Paul. Some people think that Paul is the one who wrote it, but he wrote it in Hebrew, and then Luke translated it into Greek. It's an interesting thought. It's a fascinating thought, but we just really don't know. Some people think that maybe it was a guy named Apollos, who's mentioned in the book of Acts. He's a close companion to the Apostle Paul, and the Bible tells us that Apollos was very eloquent, in his speech and the way he communicated, and Hebrews is very eloquent. And so people just try to connect that dot, but I think it's another weak argument. It's fascinating, but there's not a lot to go off of there. Some even think that it was written by a woman named Priscilla. Priscilla was a close companion of Paul as well. And some argue that the reason why there is no mention of the author was because Priscilla intentionally left her name off so that it would be more widely accepted in a male-dominated society. We really don't know. That's basically what I'm going to tell you, okay? We really don't know. But there's some fascinating arguments. What we do know is that it is the inspired Word of God, okay? It was written in about 60 A.D., so it's written about 25 to 30 years after the death and the resurrection and the ascension of Jesus Christ. So you're about 3 decades into the history of the church. It's such a young movement at this point, but it's old enough to where, people are kind of getting into a rut. They're kind of the followers of Jesus. They're kind of having challenges. It's not just this exciting, white knuckle ride, roller coaster ride faith. Like, come on, just grit and bear. It's going to be incredible. I mean, there are people who are struggling with their faith. And it's written in about 60 A.D., and we know that because there's no mention of the destruction of Jerusalem or the destruction of the Second Temple, which happened in 70 A.D., massive history moment where the Second Temple was destroyed, where Jerusalem was conquered by the Roman Empire. And so since there's no mention of that in Hebrews, it's safe to say that the book was written before that event ever took place, because the writer of Hebrews would have likely mentioned that had happened. And so that's what we know. Tradition holds that the book was written to Jewish Christians. And so these are people who grew up, in Israel. They grew up with the Jewish faith. They grew up with, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They grew up with all the Sunday school stories that you and I know about as like their ancestors. These are Jewish people who have been impacted by the message, the life, the stories of Jesus Christ, and they've accepted him as their Messiah. And so they are Jewish. They're Jewish Christians. It is, like I said, it is an epistle. Starts out as a sermon, but it really ends as a letter. When you read the New Testament, there are two things about the New Testament. When you read different books, there's two sort of literary styles that the books have. They're either going to be historical or historical narrative, like the Gospels or the book of Acts, where they're telling us like what Jesus has done. Or they're going to be like in an epistle, or we'll just call them letters, right? Or they're going to be in letter form, telling us how to live in light of what Jesus has done. And so Hebrews is an epistle. It's defined as an epistle, a general epistle, and it's going to tell us how to live our life in light of what Jesus has done. It's fascinating. Super fascinating, at least for me anyway. It is a doctrine-heavy book. It's the second most doctrine-heavy book in the New Testament, next to Romans. And there's a lot that we can learn about this book. But here's the deal. If you leave today with just one thought about Hebrews, I want you to leave with this thought right here. Hebrews is basically a long list of reasons to cling to Jesus. The book of Hebrews, from beginning to end, from chapter 1 to chapter 13, is basically a long list of reasons to cling to Jesus. I've already told you, it was written to Jewish Christians, but it was written to Jewish Christians who were basically contemplating giving up their faith. These are people who are starting to waver. These are people who are starting to question if they should really follow Jesus. And so the author has written this letter to them to encourage them and say, hey, hold on. Don't give up. It's going to be worth it, right? That's the theme throughout this letter. It's basically a long list of reasons to cling to Jesus. It's a long list of reasons why Jesus is better. Christians all over the Roman world were coming under heavy persecution at that time. Some may have been tempted to give up on their faith. And so the theme verse of the book of Hebrews comes out of Hebrews chapter 10. And I feel like this is the theme verse, all right? There might be somebody who disagrees with me. But it says this. It says, let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess. For he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds. So you'll find this central theme in the book of Hebrews that is all about, hey, don't give up. Hold on. Be steadfast in your love for Jesus and hold on. Be unswerving, in the hope that we profess. And so what you find about these early first century Jewish Christians is that they had what we would call maybe this initial conversion. They put their faith, their hope, their trust in Jesus, but then they started to experience some things that they didn't expect. How many of y'all, after you got saved, you started experiencing things you didn't plan on experiencing, right? Like, I think maybe these first century Jewish Christians probably thought that it was going to be a little bit easier to follow Jesus. And they're finding that it's actually like a million times harder to follow Jesus than they thought it was going to be. They're having a hard time, and there's some decent reasons why. Let me throw these reasons up there for you. The first reason why it was hard for them was because the Roman world wasn't very fond of Jews. All right, let's just be honest. Right, the Roman world wasn't very fond of Jews, and you can go read a bunch of history on that. It's just the truth. The Romans also weren't big fans of Christians either, because Christianity was this like uprising. It was this movement. It was this brand new kind of thing that they were intimidated by. They felt like it was an uprising against Rome, and so Rome was not a big fan of Christianity. And then also, the Jews thought that the Christians were heretics and blasphemers. So, man, if you're a Jewish Christian, right? I mean, nothing good is going on, out there. No good thoughts towards you by people who don't think like you, and it's a really tough time to be a Jewish Christian. And this is the audience. These are the people that Hebrews is written to. So if you're a Jewish Christian, you didn't have it easy. Your culture disliked you. Your family disowned you. Okay? And so could you imagine what the Hebrew Christians might have thought about 30 years into the history of the church? Could you imagine what they must have been thinking at that point? Is Christianity really worth it? Is this Christianity thing really worth it? Did I make the wrong choice? Should I just go back to the old Jewish way? Should I just go back? I mean, it would be so much easier just to go back to the way things were. Should I just go back to the old Jewish way? And so for many first century Jewish Christians, breaking from Judaism was a problem of colossal proportions. Like, would they continue to follow Jesus no matter the cost? Or would they return to Judaism, renouncing that Jesus was their Messiah? Have you ever had circumstances in your life that have caused you to consider maybe throwing in the towel spiritually? Yeah, I mean, ever? You ever gone through something that just made you wonder if you're on the right path? You ever had some things that just didn't happen like you thought they would? Maybe some prayers that weren't answered like you hoped? Maybe just some events in your life where you're just like, man, my faith is on shaky ground right now. You ever just had some thoughts like that? I mean, this is what's going on in the first century, in the first 30 years of the church, is that there's these people who turn to Jesus with all this zeal, all this excitement, all this passion, and they're finding out this thing's a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. And this thing is a lot more difficult than I thought it was going to be. And they are faced with this thought: am I going to keep serving Jesus and following Jesus no matter the cost, no matter what? Paul says this in 2 Corinthians. He writes this to the church in Corinth, chapter 4, verse 8. It says, though we experience every kind of pressure, we're not crushed. At times we don't know what to do, but quitting is not an option. Man, that's so good, right? Quitting is not an option. And so I told you, that Hebrews is basically this long list of reasons to cling to Jesus. It's really what it is. You read through it through that lens, you'll find it's basically this long list of reasons to cling to Jesus. But the main reason to cling to Jesus is because Jesus is better. The main reason to cling to Jesus is because Jesus is better. The word better is mentioned 13 different times in the book of Hebrews. It's an idea that is repeated in other forms and many more times. Words like greater or supreme or superior. Words like this repeated over and over again. Specifically, though, 13 times the word better is used. The reason why this word better keeps coming up in Hebrews is because, let's be honest and real with ourselves for a moment, we're so tempted to think at times that there's something else out there that's better. The author is saying, no, Jesus is better. There's nothing out there better than Jesus. Jesus is better than anything else, is what the author is trying to get across to the readers here, the recipients of this letter. Saying, look, guys, no, you got it wrong. Don't waver, don't drift, don't deviate. There is nothing else out there in your life that's more important than Jesus. There's nothing else out there that's better than Jesus. And so throughout this book, the author reminds them of their ancestors, reminds them of people in the Old Testament, people like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, people, like King David, massive heroes of the Jewish faith. He reminds them about all of them and compares them. And he tells them basically that each of these heroes, faith heroes, they play a part. But that Jesus' status, Jesus' sacrifice, Jesus' covenant, Jesus' ongoing ministry are far, far greater than anything these other heroes of their faith have to offer. It's the case he makes that Jesus is better. And the cool thing today is we're just really getting started, and it's going to be a rich, rich book for us to learn together. N.T. Wright says this. He says, once you see who the Son really is and the role he was always intended to play in God's plan, you won't want to go back to anything or anyone else. And so what I want to do now is just look at the first 4 verses of the book of Hebrews. and kind of wind this morning up that way. And I want to give you just some understanding because the first 4 verses is really the introduction to this thought that Jesus is better. It says here in Hebrews 1, verse 1, it says, long ago God spoke many times and in many ways to our ancestors through the prophets. So again, he's speaking to Jewish Christians. He's speaking about their ancestors. He's talking about Old Testament prophets, the Old Testament, Isaiah, Ezekiel. He's talking about Jeremiah. He's talking about Old Testament prophets. He says, long ago, God spoke many times and in many different ways. And I love what he's saying here. I love that we're in the New Testament. I love that we're in the early years of the church, decades into it, and he is saying that the God of the Bible is a speaking God. He's not a silent God, but he's a speaking God, that God spoke many years ago in many ways, and he spoke through the prophets. Here's the deal. The difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament, if you wonder, and Hebrews will help us understand this more, but the Old Testament really records God's relationship with the world through Israel. That's what the Old Testament really is. The New Testament records God's relationship with the world through Jesus. It's a massive shift. It's a massive difference. And so the audience of this letter, they would have been obviously Jewish. They would have understood the Old Testament. They would have remembered how God spoke to his people long ago through all these heroes of their faith. When we look at the Old Testament, we see that God used many different approaches to speak to the people in the Old Testament. He spoke to Isaiah in visions. He spoke to Daniel in dreams. He spoke to Abraham and Moses personally. Right? Personally. Unbelievable. In fact, Numbers chapter 12, it's an Old Testament reference. This is what it says here. It says, and the Lord said to them, now listen to what I say. If there were prophets among you, I, the Lord, would reveal myself in visions. I would speak to them in dreams, but not so with my servant Moses. Of all my house, he is the one I trust. I speak to him face to face, clearly and not in riddles. So this is an Old Testament reference showing us that God spoke. God spoke to his people. He's a speaking God. He desires to speak to us and be in relationship with us. And so the author of Hebrews is referencing that. He's reminding them that the God of the Bible is a speaking God. Goes on to verse 2, and it says this. It says, and in these final days, he has spoken to us through his Son. So he said, hey, guys, long ago, God spoke through the prophets. But in these final days, right, he has spoken to us through his Son. And so what the author does right here is he puts Jesus right on par with the Old Testament heroes of their faith. He puts Jesus right in line with the prophets of the Old Testament, like the Isaiahs, the Ezekiels, the Jeremiahs, the Moseses. Oh my gosh, Moses, right? Could you believe he could be on par with Moses? These are their heroes. And he's saying, look, like, in these final days, God has spoken to us through his Son. Puts him on par. But in the second half of verse 2, the author goes even a step further, and he shows that Jesus is actually better than the Old Testament prophets. He shows that Jesus is greater than the Old Testament prophets. This is what it says in the second half. It says, God promised everything to his Son as an inheritance. Well, that's awesome, right? You think of like the king, and you think of his son one day inheriting what the Father has. And that's an interesting thought, except it says, and through the Son, he created the universe. So not only was everything made for him, it was made by him. And so the author of Hebrews puts Jesus on this whole other level than the Old Testament prophets, Moses, all those people, and he says Jesus is God. He's better because he's God. Let me read these first 2 verses to you in a different translation, the Passion Translation. It says this, throughout our history, God has spoken to our ancestors by his prophets in many different ways. The revelation he gave them was only a fragment at a time. So a piece here, a piece there. Think of like puzzle pieces, right? He gave us a little bit here, a little bit there, and we had to put it together. Building one truth upon another. In verse 2, but to us living in these last days, God now speaks to us openly in the language of a son. the appointed heir of everything, for through him God created the panorama of all things and all time. What the author is saying here in the first 2 verses of Hebrews, he's saying that Jesus is the language of God. Jesus is the language of God. That you and I, we speak in English, but God speaks in Son. That's his language. He speaks in Son. That Jesus is the language of God, and he begins to even unpack it further. He says this in verse 3, he says, the Son radiates God's own glory and expresses the very character of God. I don't want to read that too fast, all right? The Son radiates God's own glory and expresses the very character of God. The NIV, other translations say that Jesus is the exact representation of God himself. And he sustains everything by the mighty power of his command. It says, when he had cleansed us from our sins, he sat down in the place of honor at the right hand of the majestic God in heaven. And so what he's communicating here is not only is Jesus the exact representation of God, but he is God himself. He's not just a carbon copy. He's not just a look-alike. He's not just something really similar. He is God, is what the author of Hebrews is saying here. And it has massive ramifications, because when you look at Jesus' life in the Gospels, his ministry here on earth, as you watch him love people, as you watch him heal the sick, as you watch him cast out demons, as you watch him, enter the lives of people that nobody else would care about, he is revealing to us an exact representation of who God is. That he's not this Old Testament angry monster God that wants to just wipe everybody out who doesn't like him or follow him, but that he is the God of the universe that's willing to roll up his sleeves and touch the people who nobody else is willing to touch. To love the people that nobody else is willing to touch. And he says here that Jesus is the exact representation of God. He's God himself. Paul says this in Colossians 1:15. It says, Christ is the visible image of the invisible God. He existed before anything was created, okay? So you get that. Jesus existed before Genesis 1:1, right? You understand that, hopefully. That's what that means there. In fact, we see Jesus, this is be an awesome class to teach, but we see Jesus all throughout the Old Testament, by the way. He shows up all throughout the Old Testament. He existed before anything was created and is supreme. He's better. He's greater. He's superior over all creation. That's what that means there. John 14:9, this is actually Jesus speaking. So if you've got a red letter Bible, this is in red. This is Jesus. He says, and anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. So he's the exact representation of God. He is God. He shows us the heart of God, who he really is. And then it says he sat down in the place of honor at the right hand of the majestic God in heaven. I love that he sat down, because it represents that the work was now complete. Jesus sitting down at the right hand of the Father in heaven represents that there was nothing left to do, that his sacrifice was final, that his sacrifice on the cross was complete, that him conquering sin and death, conquering the grave was final. It was once and for all. There was nothing left to be done. And so he sat down at the right hand of the Father. That's good news, guys. Fourth verse here gets a little different, because it's hard for us to really understand this, because he begins to compare Jesus to angels. And it's strange, many of us probably don't even think about angels a lot, or we have some weird ideas, We think of those Christmas tree ornaments, We think of remember those Precious Moments collections, people used to have those figurines, of angels, and you're like, oh, they're so sweet. But it says in verse 4, this shows that the Son is far greater than the angels, just as the name God gave him is greater than their names. And so the reason why this is important, the reason why he had to point this out, is because there were false teachers in many of the early churches who had taught that God could only be approached through angels. There was just this weird, twisted teaching that had gotten into the early church, and people were elevating angels to like this really high place, and we're thinking that we're being taught that that's the only way to God was through angels. And so instead of worshiping God directly, people began to actually worship angels. It is super weird. In fact, they actually started to believe that Jesus was the highest angel of God. That he wasn't the Messiah, he wasn't the Savior of the world, he wasn't the Son of God, but that he was the highest angel of God. But church, like Jesus is not just a superior angel, and he's the Son of God. And in any case, angels, just what he's saying here, are not to be worshiped, right? They're not to be elevated. They're not to be things that we seek at a higher level than we seek the Son of God. And it says that the far greater name given to Jesus was far greater than the name of angel. And what he's saying, the far greater name that Jesus was given was the name of Son. Right? There was this close relationship, this proximity to the Father, that Jesus was given the name Son. It elevates Jesus up above any supernatural being, anything like that. And so what I want us to do this morning is I want us to think about this thought that Jesus is better. We kick off the summer. We've got several months in front of us of kind of just adjusting our routine. Kids are home. Vacations are out in front of us. Lots of things to pursue. But do you believe that Jesus is better? Do you believe that Jesus is greater? Do you really believe that there is none like him? And beyond what you believe, does your life rightly reflect who Jesus is? I mean, that's the question, isn't it? Do we believe that he's the most important thing in our life? Man, I sure hope so. But then does our life rightly reflect who he really is? Stephen Gurr says this. He says, Hebrews transforms our understanding of Christ, our Christology. Christology is just our understanding of Christ, okay? He transforms our understanding of Christ, our Christology, from abstract theology to intimate relationship. This is the journey we're going to be on for months to come. This is the journey we're going to be on, June, July, and August, is understanding this intimate relationship that Jesus wants to have with you and with me. To know who he really is, so that our lives can rightly reflect who he is to others around us. Psalms 84, verse 10, the writer of this psalm says this. He says, better is one day in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere. I would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than dwell in the tents of the wicked. Some of you remember this as a song. Better is one day in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere. How could somebody say this? How could somebody write this? How could someone really say that better is one day in the presence of God? Better is one moment. Better is one second in the household of God than thousands elsewhere. How could that really happen? How could that really be true? Because once you've had a day with God, you never want to have one without him. Once you've had like one day with God, with him, one day with God of him being the most important thing in your life. Once you've had one day like that, you will never want another day apart from him. It's indescribably better. I also think that you develop an appetite for what you eat. I think that's also why you could say that better is one day in your courts, God. Because you develop an appetite for what you eat. And so for the people who maybe couldn't say that, right? They just don't have an appetite for that yet. They have an appetite for maybe just coming to church and singing some songs and hearing some sermons and hoping that that's enough to get them through whatever crisis is around the bend. You develop an appetite for what you eat. When you consume the things of God, when you consume the Word of God and you're in prayer and you're in His presence, you develop an appetite. I got to have more of that. I want to keep going back to that. I need more of Him. When you've had one day in His presence, with Him being the most important thing in your life, you'll never dream of going back. You'll never dream of re-engaging with a former lifestyle, a former desire, another way. One day in His presence, one day with Him being the most important thing in your life, it will revolutionize you. It'll change every priority. Everything that was once important will start to fall away, and He will become king. He will become supreme. He will become better. He'll become better. Jesus. Man, He's not just good for you, church. He's better for you. He's not just something you add into your life because it's good to have Jesus. It's good. I wouldn't want to not have Jesus. We don't just add Him to our life and think that that's enough. He becomes the most important thing. He becomes better than anything else we could ever imagine, anything else we could ever chase.